Okay, welcome everybody. So our first presenter is going to be Autumn M. Johnson as the Special Collections Librarian, and Nikki Cannon-Rech is the Research Services Librarian at Georgia Southern University. And their presentation is called Play to Learn, Assessing Game-Based Archival Instruction. And I know Nikki had a last-minute emergency and wasn't able to make it, so Autumn is going to be giving the presentation, but I know they worked on it together. So Autumn, I'll let you take it away.
Okay, thank you. So we're going to be beginning today's session a little further afield, since I will be sharing my experience applying traditional instructional assessment measures to a game-based archival instruction program, specifically an escape game that we designed to teach primary source literacy. Hopefully by describing these activities, though, you'll begin to understand the value game-based instruction can have in effectively teaching learners from a variety of backgrounds. So game-based instruction, that is the use of using the process of game thinking or game mechanics to reach a specific learning objective, has grown in popularity among information professionals. And my colleagues and I have used this type of instruction as a way to acclimate students to general library services and to teach info lit to first year courses. Outside of the library setting, we've also noticed our teaching faculty too have embraced the use of game-based instruction in many of their classrooms. As a special collections librarian with those dual roles, I could not ignore the success of these instructional games, and I hope to replicate the success using our library's archival collections. So plans to create a physical escape game experience in which participants could work together to examine surrogate archival collections in order to solve puzzles and clues began to develop in summer of 2019. And the goal was simple. We wanted to create an escape game program that encouraged a wide variety of participants to engage with archival primary sources and historical thinking, but in a fun, creative way. So the escape game theme and central storyline were designed around our Frances Harper materials housed in our collections. Harper was a Cornell trained naturalist who studied plant life and culture of the Okefenokee Swamp from 1912 to 1951. The collection includes a wide variety of materials, including handwritten typed correspondence, gov docs, field notebooks, photographs, film recordings. And the materials have been used by a wide range of researchers and uses from a variety of fields. The game itself included a brief overview of game rules by the game master, led by a librarian, followed by a 5-minute video introduction to a fictitious but real-world scenario of a field researcher needing access to difficult to find archival sources. So working in small groups of 4 to 10, participants then had 45 minutes of gameplay to find clues and solve a series of 7 interconnected puzzles, whereby they eventually found themselves transported in the past and the Okefenokee of the 30s. The game ended, whether or not the group was successful, with a 10-minute debriefing activity with the librarian. And more details about this collection and our steps in designing the overall program will be shared in a link I'll share at the end. But something worthy of mentioning at this design phase was the puzzle design process we employed. So each individual puzzle task was created using a backwards design technique, and guidelines I'm sure everyone in this group is familiar with, the guidelines for primary source literacy developed by the SAA ACRL RBMS Joint Task Force. So these specific student learning outcomes provided the critical framework with which we developed tasks designed to engage archival conceptualization, discovery, and interpretation. So for example, one of our puzzles including providing players with a list of documents that were needed for their research. Throughout the course of the game, players would discover all but one of these field notebooks as clues. And this remaining field notebook came to represent the key to solving the overall puzzle. So this particular task reinforced the idea that historical records may never existed, may not have survived, or may not be collected or publicly accessible. But in assessing both the game design and the learning, we actually took multiple approaches in the end. And those included both summative and formative assessments. So a bit of background, we executed this program through a 3-phase approach. The first phase involved running our library staff and student workers through preview game sessions. We then opened the game to our teaching faculty in a second phase, hoping to fine-tune the game, but also increase faculty buy-in. In these first two phases, we were able to observe participant play and make observations about the effectiveness of our game and puzzles. We employed two forms of summative assessments with these early participants to not only assess, again, the overall game and its design, but also to measure their learning. For example, one of the most significant changes we made to our game design was developing accessible alternatives to puzzles that had an audio or visual element. We were able to make these changes through feedback we received from the participants in the form of an anonymous survey, which we distributed to all of our preview game participants in the form of a LibWizard anonymous survey. And then we also had small focus groups. Particularly the small focus groups allowed game designers, me, Nikki, the ability to rethink puzzles and the learning skills that we hope to convey, particularly when it came to more higher levels of learning involving interpreting and analyzing primary sources. In fact, one of our biology faculty who went through a preview game helped edit our post-game science assessment worksheet and actually provided us contemporary field notebooks so that we could more accurately gauge students' ability to factor physical and material elements into their interpretation of primary sources. The third phase, the final phase, involved launching the program overall to the campus community. And in all, we had 139 undergraduates and graduate students complete the Secret Sources and Swamp escape game in a period of less than 2 weeks. And because we implemented the backwards design approach, as we found observing students all 139 going through this, most of our clues and puzzles, by their very nature, were designed to mimic the archival primary research process. By completing tasks, game participants were performing or actively demonstrating to us that they were developing the primary source literacy skills. I've mentioned the historic records may never have existed example. And here are some of the surrogate materials we ended up making for that. But the game as a whole required participants to perform skills such as identifying and communicating information found in primary sources and identifying key components such as how it was created, by whom, when, and what. All of those elements became the key, the code for certain locks and mechanisms that they needed to solve. But again, once again, after 45 minutes of gameplay, a faculty librarian would also lead each group into a post-game exercise. This would include an overview of the game room where we'd answer any questions they had or any clarifying questions that they had about the room, the game, or maybe any assumptions that they had made or that they were playing the game. Participants would then be moved into the starting room, whereby the faculty librarian would provide greater context to the collection and introduce participants to the program LibGuide, to the physical exhibition, and to some of the greater historical context and the inspiration for the game. Each participant then was given an assessment worksheet. And we designed 3 worksheets, including one for our humanities, history majors, but one for science majors, which I mentioned was edited with the help of a faculty member. And we also had a just for fun one for those who signed up for the game for the experience rather than any kind of credited opportunity. And through our 10-minute post-game exercise, we were able to measure a lot of those learning skills that we hope to build into the puzzles. The quantifiable and qualitative data we collected from the worksheets overwhelmingly showed most students were able to identify the location of primary sources, identify and communicate information found in those sources, and several other targeted outcomes I've mentioned throughout. And then also more anecdotally, it helped us make slight improvements in the game and the game experience throughout the 2 weeks that we launched this to the public. We also had some instructor-led activities. So teaching faculty who require the game as part of course requirements or an extra credit opportunity also created their own assessments. They shared these at a later date. Generally, these were 1 to 3 page responses, and overwhelmingly, they demonstrated increased awareness of special collections, deeper understanding of archival primary sources and overall positive game experience. And in fact, in future iterations, we are going to be working with a couple of faculty on this to develop a rubric to measure these. And these were critical in helping us identify other learning outcomes that we didn't even realize could be measured. For instance, some students realized the teaching applications for these. So what did we learn? Assessment should be about continuous improvement as to the game design and to the learning. We were constantly making changes throughout. Varying assessment measures can capture more robust data, even with a small population and a 2-week window. And quantitative and qualitative data is a meaningful way to articulate program value, especially as we are starting to plan for National and Georgia Archives Month 2021. This has been really helpful to our stakeholders. More information is on bit.ly/game and archives. And my name is Autumn. My colleague is Nikki Cannon-Rech, and thank you.
Thank you so much, Autumn, for your wonderful presentation. Next up, we have Carrie Mastley, the Assistant Professor, Manuscripts Librarian of Mississippi State University. And Carrie's presentation is called Measuring Archival Literacy Skills in Undergraduate Students, a Theory-Based Approach. And Carrie, you're still muted.
Sorry about that. I was over here just talking away. So hi, my name is Carrie Mastley, and I'm the Manuscripts Librarian at Mississippi State University Libraries. I'm here today to share with you our theory-based approach to measuring archival literacy skills in undergraduate students. Excuse me. So special collections instruction at Mississippi State University Libraries normally follows one of two patterns. We have what we call one-shot sessions, where instructors bring their students into our department to learn more about archives and special collections, as well as view primary source materials that reinforce themes explored in their classrooms. The second pattern is what we refer to as our long haulers, where students receive one or more instruction sessions from us, as well as additional support throughout the semester to complete their coursework for their class. So think of the latter as being somewhat like an embedded archivist for the class, in which we help support classroom objectives by providing access to primary source materials. So in the fall of 2019, or as we like to call the before times, our department adapted a theory-based archival literacy approach. And it's called Archival Literacy Competencies for Undergraduate History Majors. And in this document, there's 6 skills that are outlined that were put together based on a survey of what undergraduate history teachers thought that their students should be able to master. And so our authors came up with six skills to which undergraduate students should be exposed. They thought that they should be able to accurately conceive of primary sources, locate primary sources, use a research question, evidence, and argumentation to advance a thesis, obtain guidance from archivists, demonstrate acculturation to archives, and follow publication protocols. So we made it a priority to emphasize these competencies in our instruction and wanted to develop a tool to measure how successful students were at mastering these skills, especially regarding our repeat classes who would have long-term exposure to the archive and special collections setting. So to do this, we decided the best approach would be to create a 2-part survey system, where one survey would be administered before students received any instruction from special collections, and one survey would be administered at a given semester's close after students completed their culminating projects requiring the use of primary sources. So I want to pause to note that we develop extremely close relationships with the instructors of these classes. Thus, we ask the course instructors to administer these surveys for us, which many, if not all, are happy to do. So the overarching goal for our survey design was to make it exhaustive of the theory and objectives we hope to cover in each of our instruction sessions, no matter the discipline of the course. For instance, we not only teach extended history classes, but we also have students from English disciplines and soon to be architecture classes as well. So we wanted to make sure it would apply to all of these different disciplines. But we really didn't want the survey to be extraordinarily long. We didn't want it to be any longer than 10 questions because survey fatigue is very real. So working closely with our library's assessment committee, this is a group responsible for approving instructional surveys administered at our institution. We developed a 9-question pre-instructional survey and a 10-question post-instructional survey using the LibWizard platform. So here's our survey design. As you can see, the survey opens with an informed consent form. We made the decision to have our IRB review our survey on the off chance that we wanted to use the data in a research project someday. I've also started including a disclaimer at the top of the survey that reminds students that this is a survey for special collections instruction and not for their primary course, because I found that students sometimes are confused. And on past surveys, I've received feedback related to the primary course instruction. And I was kind of afraid that maybe my data was a little skewed because they were reflecting the instruction that they were getting in their primary course rather than the instruction they were getting from special collections faculty. So this little disclaimer has been helpful. I've noticed that the data I've gotten has been a lot more targeted. So the first section of the survey just includes, basic demographic information. We want to know, what's their status at Mississippi State University. So basically, what year are they in their study? And if they've ever conducted research in the archive or special collections before. This just helps us get a feel for our students who will be teaching during the semester. The next section, however, is composed of 6 statements that students must respond to using a Likert scale, marking the extent to which they agree or disagree. So this section, while brief, encompasses the skills noted in the archival literacy competencies for undergraduate history majors, such as familiarity with the archives and related terminology and policies, using primary sources to create an argument, understanding the role of an archivist in the research process, how to cite primary sources, and how to obtain permission to publish archival resources. The third and final section contains a short answer question where students may write their concerns, questions, or suggestions for upcoming or past sessions. Finally, we added an additional question to the post survey, which asked students to measure to what extent a given instruction session met or exceeded their expectations. Per our institution's assessment policies, we have to include that question. It really has nothing to do with the archival literacy standards. This is just something that our local institution requires. And then finally, the survey closes with a short message. Sometimes instructors offer to give extra credit as an incentive for students to take the survey. So in those cases, I include a reminder for the student to screenshot the closing screen. We found that if there's incentive, even a low stakes incentive, like a 1-point extra credit, students will be more likely to respond to the survey. So overall, we've had success with using the survey model. I would estimate our completion rate to be at least 75% when there is buy-in from the course instructor. Again, forming those close relationships with these instructors is really helpful, and checking in with them periodically to say, hey, have you given the link out yet, is also really helpful. So the responses are incredibly beneficial when planning for future iterations of each course. It's helpful to look back on past responses to see trends and see what competencies we may need to spend more time discussing in our instruction. The pre-surveys are also incredibly useful in determining any given class's starting point and what skills they may need extra help navigating in the weeks to come. Further, the short answer section is also is really beneficial because it gives students the opportunity to vent their anxieties and expectations of the archival component of their course. The survey results have also proven helpful when debriefing with the primary course instructors at a semester's close to troubleshoot what worked, what didn't work, and what should be done differently. In cases where the primary course instructor may change semester to semester, these results have also proven beneficial to them as well while planning the course. We're able to share what other instructors have found helpful in areas where students may need extra help. So since the survey was first implemented just prior to the COVID-19 pandemic in January, February of 2020, all of our data collected represents special collections instruction in a virtual environment. So this coming fall will mark our return to face-to-face instruction. So it'll be interesting to compare that data against the data we've collected over the course of the last 3 semesters to see how students' needs differ between physical and virtual learning environments. So that's my presentation. If anybody's interested in checking out the archival literacy competencies, you can find that information here. And I'm happy to answer any questions at this presentation's close, as well as via email. So thank you.
Thank you, Carrie. That was really, really interesting. Our next presenters are Colin Deinhardt, the Reader Services and Instructional Librarian, and Roma Kail, Reader Services from the University of Toronto Victoria Library and Archives. Their presentation is Assessing Archival Literacy in First-Year Undergraduates, Past, Present, and Future.
Thank you. So hello, my name is Roma Kail, and I am here today with my colleague Colin Deinhardt. And we are, as you said, instructional and special collections librarians from Victoria University in the University of Toronto. So Colin and I will use a case study to illustrate one way in which we assess archival literacy in first-year undergraduates. So I will just first describe the context and the course in which we do this. And then Colin will focus on our application and results of one assessment and learning tool, and I'll end with our future directions. So I think as previous people have mentioned, our case study really revolves around collaboration, and it's between 3 parties. So the librarians and archivists, the professor or course instructor, and up to 25 undergraduate students. So in our case, it's quite a small seminar group. So for over the past 15 years, we have been embedded in the first-year seminar course, it's called Vic 184, Individuals and the Public Sphere, and it's Cultural Memory. And it's developed and taught by a professor, Anne Urbancic. So in the course, students engage in archival research to produce a final term paper, and they must find, view, and critically engage with material from an archival font of their choice. So they pick an archival font, figure out how to request it from the repository, and then spend most of the term critically reviewing and requesting material in order to answer questions, which are part of their final report. And the questions provided by the professor actually develop the students' archival literacy skills. And the type of learning that happens in this course can be heard in this quotation from a student's midterm oral presentation, and I'll just read it. The student says, "Just because there are so few personal documents in the collection does not mean that they did not exist or that the person did not have a personal life. Things change. People may not have recorded these things the same way as in previous or present times." So the fact that the documents may not have existed is noted by the student, as was pointed out, I think, in the first presentation too. So from the beginning, our goal was really to articulate and measure the types of archival and information literacy that are evident in student comments like this. Our learning outcomes over the years and our assessment methods have changed slightly. So this dates me, but formerly I used the Kent State University's standardized assessment for information literacy skills, or project SAILS, to our first articulate and measure some of the learning outcomes. But currently we do use a pre and post survey, not too unlike what my colleague before was just talking about. But this time it is loosely based on project SAILS. And now, though, we are moving towards applying the SAA RBMS guidelines for primary source literacy. as was talked about in the first presentation. We are applying them to re-articulate our outcomes, but we also hope to look at tools such as the Threshold Achievement Test for Literacy, or TATL, to see if they yield relevant measurement techniques, the way SAILS did in the past. So before I pass things off to Colin, I'll just put our pre and post survey into a bit of context. So we are afforded several points of interaction with the students, and these interactions provide us a range and sequence of assessment opportunities. So to start with, we do have a what we call a pre-self-awareness survey on using archives, but it is followed by 2 instructional sessions on using primary and secondary sources, which are taught by librarians and archivists, and we are then available at points of need at the reference desk or for research consultations. We attend the students' midterm oral presentations, and we receive their final written reports on a voluntary basis. And that wasn't always the case. So then lastly, at the end of term, we do launch a post self-awareness survey, and they usually complete that after they have submitted their final report. So I'll now pass things over to Colin, who will focus specifically on the pre and post survey.
Thank you. So we designed a straightforward diagnostic assessment tool, which, as Roma mentioned, we call the Archival Self-Awareness Survey, which had 7 questions, later expanded to 10. Both the pre-test and post-test are ungraded and anonymous, and they're administered through the course management system, initially Blackboard, now Canvas. In terms of our purposes, at least in terms of the pre-test, one was to simply gauge students' current level of knowledge or confidence to undertake archival research, but also to allow students to, or give them a chance to assess their own current comfort level or knowledge in this area. But one other way that we thought about it is in terms of purposes was to use it, the pretest at least, as a kind of pedagogical tool to prime students prior to the in-class instruction session, simply to alert them to aspects of archival research that they may not have considered before, or to direct their attention to specific important issues that so they'll know to pay attention to those parts in the class, or perhaps even give them a chance to formulate some questions in advance that they can raise in the class discussion if they haven't been satisfactorily answered by the librarian's presentation. And since archival research will be uncharted territory for most of them, the pretest gives them a chance to process some of the information ahead of time so that the in-class session is not too overwhelming for them, because it does cover a lot of ground. At least this is our thinking about the purpose of the pretest especially. Now, in terms of the actual questions we used, I won't read them out here, but just to give you an overview, they do cover areas such as practical concerns like using a finding aid and proper handling of archival materials, to ethical issues like copyright and reproducing materials, to how libraries and archives organize information differently. Each of the items on the survey are a 5-point Likert type question, so students can indicate whether they strongly agree to strongly disagree with each statement. Again, I won't read them out themselves, but I would highlight a few of them where students traditionally don't indicate very much confidence, and perhaps that's not surprising, but a few of them would be statements such as, I can explain how research in a library differs from research in an archives, or I know how to use a finding aid to find what I'm looking for, or I know how to properly handle archival materials to preserve them for future researchers. So perhaps not surprising, prior to instruction, students indicated a general understanding of what archives are and what they collect, but when it came to specific questions such as how archives organize information, or how they differ from libraries, or how to use a finding aid, few, if any, agreed or strongly agreed with the statement in question. So just to give one example here, our question number 4 asks students to agree or disagree with the statement, I can explain how research in a library differs from research in an archive. In the pretest, about 88% either disagreed or neither agreed nor disagreed with the statement, indicating that confidence in their understanding of research in the two, indicating little confidence in their understanding of how research in the two different institutional settings varies, right? So I point out this question specifically, and it's really nothing here is earth-shattering at all. But one of the other additional purposes or uses of the pretest, at least for our purposes, is it gave us a kind of opportunity for sober second thoughts to sort of tweak the instruction session based on the pretest results. So I should note first that both the pretest and the post-test were available to students for about a week, and the pretest closed a few days prior to the instruction session. So this allowed us to make any changes to the lesson plan in class, and it also provided us with the opportunity to make explicit reference to the pretest results in class, thus reinforcing sort of important points and connecting it to the work that they had done prior to coming to class. Right? So at least in one iteration of the instruction session, our response to the question that I noted above led us to rethink a couple of things. Well, we decided to introduce a short think, pair, share activity where students could use this slide that you're looking at here to brainstorm some differences between libraries and archives. It could also serve as a useful sort of entry point into the other questions that students had difficulty with, or where they indicated that they didn't have very much confidence. For example, how to use finding aid or how archives organize information in general. So perhaps not surprisingly, the post-test results show a large increase in students' confidence when it comes to the differences in the research process in libraries and archives. In this year, which is, 2018 again, same one, 100% indicated that they understood the differences between libraries and archives, and that compared to the pretest when 88% indicated that the opposite, exactly, a lack of knowledge or awareness or not. So whether or not these sort of confidence levels captured in the post-test really serve as a proxy for student learning, I think that the post-test nevertheless provide students with an opportunity to reflect on their own growth in confidence and knowledge and in the archival or research process as well. So at this point, I'll just hand it back to Roma to wrap up.
Thanks, Colin. So I'll just briefly conclude with a list of our future directions. So as we've illustrated and mentioned, we hope to firstly, continue with our collaborative and iterative approach. We also hope to re-articulate our outcomes in a way that is compatible with current assessment standards. And ways of articulating, is it compatible with current assessment standards, and maybe to use the SAA RBMS guidelines as a way to re-articulate some of those outcomes. We hope to improve or update our pre and post self-awareness survey, possibly create a more formal IL rubric like the ones in the TPS guidelines toolkit, which I really benefited from reading. And then finally, investigate current assessment tools, possibly TADL, for relevant assessment strategies. So that that sums up our presentation, but we're happy to answer questions at the appropriate time. And our emails are here if anybody is interested in contacting us separately. So thank you for having us.
Thank you so much. That was a wonderful presentation. Our next presenters are J. Prevent, the Special Collections Assessment Archivist and Graduate Program Education and Outreach Archivist, and Matt Strandmark, the Education Archivist, both from the University of Kentucky. And their presentation is called Meaningful Outcomes, Results from a Pilot Implementation of the Guidelines for Primary Source Literacy.
Sorry, I lost my mute button. There we go. All right, great. So thanks everyone for allowing us to present today and talk to you a little bit about our pilot implementation of the guidelines for primary source literacy. I'm J. Bravent, and this is...
Yeah, I'm Matt Strandmark, so I'm the Education Archivist at the University of Kentucky.
So we are part of the team that does the teaching with primary sources here in Special Collections. And the title for the presentation today, Meaningful Outcomes, actually comes from the faculty surveys that Matt does, where he gets feedback from the faculty after their experiences bringing students to Special Collections. And one of the important aspects of the pilot implementation that we have done was that we started to get a lot of feedback from faculty saying that the outcomes were more meaningful, or that there were meaningful outcomes. And that was a phrase, either specifically or a paraphrase of the kinds of positive feedback that we were getting following the pilot. So the pilot started see, there we go. We implemented the pilot starting in 2018, and the purpose was to create a transition or a bridge from the previous assessment program that we had been using here at UK. For the previous 5 years, we were required to use one of 4 information literacy outcomes that had been developed by the main library. And they were very useful in determining a lot of improvements that we could do with our teaching, but they weren't geared specifically towards archival materials or towards primary source literacy. So they left a little bit of a gap between the faculty's goals and desired learning outcomes for bringing students to the archives and to special collections, and how we were able to assess what the students were learning. So we also teach somewhere between usually 60 to, depending on the semester, to up to 120 courses per semester. And assessing every single course that came in was becoming a bit of a burden. So we wanted to come up with some strategic ways through this pilot program to mitigate some of that. So the first part of the plan included sampling and course selection. So the idea that we were seeing a lot of the results repeating over time each year with certain types of classes. So we wanted to focus our course selection and our assessment on just a few specific courses that we knew we could get basically the most assessment bang for our buck. So in 2018, we assessed a freshman writing course that is required for most first year students coming to UK, and just a few of the sections for that. And then we also assessed a honors 101 course that was coming to special collections for a very specific activity. And then in the fall of 2019, we assessed a philosophy course, a 300 level course, and a 100 level history course. So we assessed, we aligned the selection of learning outcomes with our faculty expectations. And Matt will talk a little bit more about how that process went. But the activity purpose and the desired session outcomes were driven by the faculty's needs and the overall course goals and expected outcomes for the course. We used a rubric that was very similar to the information literacy rubrics that we had been using in the past. We kept the same terminology and the same framework so that we could transition the program in steps and continue to use some of the same structures. And then we would teach the session, administer the post-assessment survey. There would be scoring and norming of the assessment, and then a discussion of results and evaluation. So in many ways, this actually serves a dual purpose of formative and summative assessment. So for the faculty member within this activity being embedded in the course, it's a formative assessment that they can use as part of the different assignments that the students use, either before coming to the archives, while they're doing the archival activity as part of an assignment, or also towards the end of the course to see how well the students learned the material and the skills that they needed to come to the when they came to the archives. And then it's a summative assessment for us programmatically to look at how we can improve our teaching and the implementation of the course activities moving forward. And here's an example of the rubric. We usually choose 3, I don't think we've had more than 4 learning outcomes that we've done per course. And we ask 3 questions, and they're short answer questions. So we've tried to keep it to where the students will have enough time and attention to answer, we think, 3 questions and without making it too long for them to complete. And now Matt's going to talk about implementation.
Yeah, so and as Jay mentioned already, a lot of this was already tied into the fact that we were doing this in partnership with faculty, right? So, we talked about this pilot plan with faculty members that I would meet with before teaching the sessions, even before the semester started. Specifically, most of these were instructors that we had worked with before, but I made an extra effort to let them know that we were kind of doing this as well, and that we kind of had them as partners in the process. And we're always very lucky with the faculty at UK that they are game with pretty much anything, and we're really willing to help out. And we're excited about making these experiences more valuable for their students as well. So we discussed the pilot plan with the faculty members during pre-semester planning and scheduling the classes. And then we taught the class sessions with these learning outcomes in mind. So these were the 2 most recent that we did for a large history survey course, and then for a much more specific advanced course actually about the philosophy and ethics of medicine and science, geared toward pre-med students. So it was mostly juniors and senior pre-med students who participated in that. So as is pretty a normal process, right? We created this online assessment tool in Qualtrics with these questions that aligned with the rubric that in turn aligned with the guidelines. So we've taught the classes, we pass it on to the instructors. We sent this online assessment link to the faculty members with a reminder of what we had talked about before the semester started. So as all of us are aware, we get into the middle of the semesters and these things often get lost. We mentioned kind of extra credit and different ways to kind of incentivize this. It was really valuable for me to be able to point out and say, remember when we talked about this before the semester started, and that generally made it pretty easy to get a lot of responses to these surveys. So about 2 to 3 weeks following the class visits, and this kind of planning and this partnership with the faculty members really assured those high participation rates since it was built into the class visits from the very beginning, and because we had already discussed it and planned it together. So we collected the assessment for a couple weeks, downloaded and formatted the responses to correspond with the rubric. And then we had 3 individuals, myself, Jay, and then the education graduate assistant, score these individually and then come together and average what those results look like. So a very straightforward process, but really the most important thing to keep in mind about what we did was, really building it into the course experience from the beginning and partnering with faculty members to ensure participation and to make sure it would have some kind of meaningful outcome for them and for their students.
Okay, so the summary of results. What we saw was that sampling was a great success. We proved that it could be very effective as a way to gain insights into potential teaching improvements without overburdening or belaboring the assessment process.
Yeah, and I found that it made the assessment a lot more, we keep seeing these same words over and over, but meaningful, useful, and interesting to me as the teacher who is doing these classes. Instead of having to worry about trying to assess every single class that we saw, having this much more targeted made it a lot less burdensome and a lot easier and a lot more efficient for us to do.
And we started to see that the students were providing more accurate, relevant, and focused answers because the questions were geared towards more specific learning outcomes from the guidelines than the ones that we had been using in the previous 5 years.
Yeah, and it really made it seem like this was kind of assessment with the sharper edge, for lack of a better word, right? So it made the class sessions more focused, made it simpler for students, and rather than worrying about like covering enough ground for these, blanket wide assessments I was going to have to, send out, we could dive a lot more deeply into 1 or 2 key concepts, which made teaching a lot more effective and easier for me too.
So using the most directly relevant learning outcomes was a key component to students and faculty getting the most out of the survey itself. And it allowed the survey to become part of the course. And I know a lot of faculty appreciated having that feedback, that immediate formative feedback in the middle of the course, so that if they needed to repeat some of the skills or information that the students maybe didn't quite get, maybe the bias part of the activity didn't quite come through to some of the students. The faculty member had the opportunity to go back and cover that ground again if necessary.
Yeah, and I've brought this up over and over again, but this also really helped us to foster even more collaboration and partnership with our faculty members because they could see and understood that we were interested in improving our teaching and creating these experiences that were more meaningful and more useful, that did not add kind of extra work for them or make it a superfluous experience for their students. So that was also a really important part of this. The guidelines also kind of allowed us to sell this to others in the university. Jay referenced this before, that we kind of were transitioning from a libraries-wide information literacy assessment program. And because we had these more targeted and professional guidelines, we were able to justify kind of moving away from those. So we're that maybe we're not as fitted to the work that we were doing. So that was really valuable as well, that we were able to point to these and use these as that resource. Also, I wanted to say that I was more engaged. So I don't know if any of you have experienced this, but sometimes when I'm teaching the same classes over and over again, I find myself having to make sure I remain engaged. I did not have that problem with these classes, right? So I had kind of had the freedom to be more creative with the planning for these sessions due to the flexibility of the assessment program, and also allowed me to schedule more total classes without having to really worrying about doing that kind of blanket wide assessment that we had done in years past as well.
So since this is the kind of data that you can't really compare from year to year because you're looking at a completely different group of students, you're looking at students who are at multiple levels throughout their educational journey through their undergraduate experience. It's not quantitative data quite in that form, but we were able to look at a few data points that gave us a little bit of an insight to estimate the improvement in teaching effectiveness. So for example, I've only crunched numbers comparing our pilot to the previous 2 years, but the average score improved slightly. So we went from about a 1.8 to a 2.1. I'd like to continue to crunch the data and see if we get sort of an average better score, if that just kind of gives a sense of that the students were doing better on the assessments. And then also the average word length of the answers improved by actually quite a bit, especially for the honors students, which might be expected. But the students were clearly more engaged. They gave longer answers and provided, this just provided another observation to help us to quantify the personal experiences and the reflections that we had on our teaching outcomes and place a little bit of context around the feedback that we were also getting from the faculty. All right, so thank you so much. If you'd like to get in touch to talk about anything, here are emails.
Thank you. Thank you. That's great. So our next presenters are Catherine Fox, Head of Public Services and Engagement, and Kathleen Monahan, Reference Instruction and Digital Services Librarian at Boston College. And their presentation is from critiques about the carpet color to things we can actually control, instruction assessment data at Burns Library, Boston College.
Hey everyone, thank you. Can everyone hear me? Yes. Great, awesome. Yeah, so my name is Kathleen, she, her pronouns. I'm the reference instruction librarian. Catherine, do you want to introduce yourself?
I'm Catherine. I am the head of public services. I also use she, her pronouns. Because our names are similar, you can often refer to us as Fox and Monahan, but we will each respond to the other person's name. So together we consist of the Burns Library Instruction Program, which, and we started to do assessment of our instruction sessions in the fall 2017 semester, when there was a big push in the libraries to start getting assessment of instruction. So we said, fine, let's do this. Each class, we do assign learning objectives based on what the faculty member have told us they would like. And if they don't tell us, we assign them anyway. We cannot get many of our faculty to understand primary source literacies yet. That's what we're working on. But what we did was designed a variation on the 3-2-1 form with 3 questions, a simple half sheet handout that we gave at the end of class with the, what is one thing that you learned? What do you wish we'd covered more in depth? And what questions do you still have about Burns or the BC libraries? Since that time, we've killed a lot of trees. We've done about 2,700 surveys. And we've made slight changes, but we've been consistent, but we have made slight changes. And the one thing that we learned from this was it's important to ask them if they want us to answer their questions. So we added to the form that we wanted, if they wanted us to contact them to follow up and then give us the best way to do so. And then we threw in any additional comments on the session, which is where the comedy gold usually enters. What we've learned during the instruction sessions is that on our detailed class plans to always put in time for assessment. It makes it much easier to actually get it and for students to not blow it off if they're given the time to do it and it has been made part of class.
So after each session, we compile all these random half sheets forms into one Google Doc with the answers put up via question, and we email that to the faculty after each class. It's a good way to just be in contact with the faculty as follow-up. Occasionally, they do actually read it and review it and offer comments on their own. And this is also occasionally we'll already just start talking about, hey, it looks like my students learned a lot. Can I bring my class back next semester? After a year of doing this, we created a Google form for easier data entry capture and analysis, so that way it was a bit easier to copy and paste everything into something to share with the faculty. And we, the librarians, also reviewed this after every class, and we made notes for next time. What worked in this class? What didn't work in this class? Did this class go as badly as I thought it did? It's usually reassuring to find out the students were okay. We keep these in a very highly structured Google Drive, so that if a class returns, the first thing we do is pull up the assessment from the last time we taught this class with this faculty member. And this way we can kind of use this feedback in order to make incremental changes to the class plan. Like, hey, last time your class came in, this didn't really work, so we would like to try this instead and see if they get it. At the end of each school year, we compile the data into an aggregate for all the sessions of the year. Qualitative data is really tricky to deal with, but patterns do emerge. It also provides us a better way to read each class's feedback and kind of see it as a whole. We developed about 6 standard categories per question to roughly sort everything in, and we're mostly locked into these categories now since we've been using them for a while, but there's overlap between the questions. Most of the problem is that some of the comments can go into multiple buckets, and we've also had different people sort at different years, so it's messy. But it is useful for marketing and outreach, and the sorting helps us figure out where we want to go in our method data to pull quotes for different things. However, it is still hard to package this data for outreach to faculty. So if anyone has good luck with that, we would love to hear about it.
In about 2018, we started adding some quantitative data points, and we quickly learned that the students didn't really understand the question. They got status, but they didn't get the number of previous class sessions at Burns seemed highly inflated for something that we hadn't had that robust of an instruction program for long. The number of independent research visits to Burns, they did not understand that that was a visit to the reading room. The number of visits to Burns exhibits or programs, they did not seem to understand that anyway. These were an attempt by our senior administration to understand if instruction had any effect on awareness or attendance at Burns events. That's an outreach function that we're not necessarily that interested in. So we stuck with these questions for 2 years, but ultimately cut them back to what we cared about, their status and how many instruction sessions that they have had before. And even with that, we work with clipboards in class, and the instruction or assessment forms are on a clipboard, and the clips can hide the data points. And so you can be going through class and going, why didn't they answer these questions? Well, they were hidden by the clipboards. So we resized our assessment form to have a really good header so that no information is hidden. When it came to pandemic time, we were glad we already had the Google form set up, and we still scheduled time for assessment in our online classes. They were far more likely to do it while they were still in class. So we would just drop a bit.ly with a link to the assessment form into the chat, and we would get an unusually high return rate in online classes, probably higher than we did in in-person classes.
So in spring 2021, we added a DEI question to it to our feedback as well, which is, are there any accessibility or equity gaps we should be more aware of for future sessions? We added this to hold ourselves accountable for inclusive teaching practices, which is a goal of our program. The students largely just seem to apply it to themselves and their abilities, which is really valuable insight. But there have been a few who have been noting the nature of the materials they are working with, which is the way to win my heart, is to point out the gaps in our collections to us.
With so much faculty or so much student assessment under our belts, and since we found it so helpful, we wanted to document the reactions from the faculty that we partner with in these classes as well. So what we did was create questions with a 4-point Likert scale because I believe that they must pick a side. There is no neutrality. And room for comments if they also wanted to put those in there. And it's like our instruction request form. It's guiding them to think about the things that we think about when we're designing classes, so they can think about what they might do differently next time, what they might ask us to do differently next time.
So things that we've learned, first off, is just doing assessment as often as possible. It doesn't have to be perfect, but consistency helps. So consistency in questions helps you learn how to read the data. For example, we've learned that Boston College students are extremely polite. So our second question, which is, what do you wish we had covered more in depth, is the best way to tell how the session actually went, because they're just going to lie on additional comments and just say, interesting and informative, thanks. And so just using the same questions over and over is like how we figured out how to read the actual data.
And we also recommend just making the time to look at the feedback after the class, at the end of the semester, and before the next class visits if it returns. As J. Marie pointed out, the students are different, but the learning objectives haven't changed, and most likely the class plan hasn't changed that much either. So we can use a little bit about what we learned from a previous session on the next session. And we've used it to change our instructional approaches or create content to fill in some consistent gaps that we've identified. We realized quite quickly that we needed to adopt a more consistent demonstration of what we're asking them to do. And we would describe it and then let them go. Now we describe it, we demo it and let them go. And we use patterns of what questions were being asked to create some of the videos on our playlist about special collections. Things like an introduction that asks all the questions over and over again. You know, how to do this, how to do that, so that we can send some of those both as pre-work for class, most notably how to find the library, and post-work reminders on how to search and how to use our Burns Library account and that sort of thing. Analyze it as much as you can, but don't go crazy. It is helpful on both the granular level. How did that class go? What do I need to do if I am going to run it again? As well as on the overall level, what questions or comments am I seeing consistently? And is that something that I can address and change?
Most important thing is just keep a sense of humor about it. You will laugh a lot at the things students tell you. We do tell them to be honest and they don't have to be nice, which some of them take us up on it. So we wanted to share some of our more entertaining feedback that we've gotten through the assessment forums, including my favorite, which this presentation is named after, which at the green carpet, I think is in poor taste to the value of the collection, and the white lights could be warmer and more inviting. Students, they're great.
Yeah, we've been called adorable as well, which we find interesting. But this is what we do at Burns. We're not saying it's perfect or the only way to do assessment, but if you have questions about how we've done this, get in touch with us. There are links to our various forums and to our contact information on this slide as well. And we hope this has helped someone somewhere.
Thank you so much. That was wonderful. And now for our final presenter, Sarah McCluskey, the project archivist of the Bentley Historical Library at the University of Michigan. And her presentation is called Post-Visit Surveys for In-Person and Virtual Classes.
Right, give me just a second here, I'll share my slides. Okay. There we go. So I'm going to be talking about surveys that I developed as part of our instruction program at Bentley. But before I get into what those look like, I'll talk a little bit about the context in which it's happening. So the Bentley Historical Library is at the University of Michigan. We are not part of the larger library system. we're kind of off in our own separate building, and we hold the institutional archives, the university's records, and then also state history collections. We have 20 or so staff, 6 in our reference and instruction team, and then 2 of whom, me and my supervisor, Cinda Nofziger, are the ones who do most of the instruction and most of the class sessions. Pre-COVID, we normally did about 25 to 30 class sessions a semester. The past couple of semesters, that's been fewer, partly intentionally because we did less outreach. We were trying to plan for reference staff involvement in some other digitization projects that would be useful to classes, which meant we had a little bit less time to devote to planning individual sessions. So the shape that our instruction assessment has taken so far is mainly post-class surveys. We haven't handed one out before. We do kind of try to, when we're talking with students, figure out what they already know or what their starting thoughts on archives are. But partly because we are separate from the library system, we're up on the university's North Campus, which is about a 20-minute bus ride away from where most of our students have their other classes. So we generally plan to start a little bit late and a little bit early so that they don't get panicky about being late to their next class. And that really kind of, especially if it's a 50-minute class, that cuts down the amount of time we have. So we've stuck with just the one for right now. And we use a couple of different kind of benchmarks or sources to refer to. One, as has been mentioned many times already, is the SAA RBMS guidelines for primary source literacy. And so one of the things I did when these first came out was rework kind of an older existing survey that we had and change it so that the questions lined up better with these particular guidelines. We also have kind of mapped it to a slightly earlier article by Peter Carini, so information literacy for archives and special collections. And between those two, I think we've been able to kind of pick out the things that are most often the priority for our classes in terms of learning outcomes. As I was redesigning these surveys, trying to figure out what's reasonable, how many questions is too many, when should I stop myself and say, nope, nobody's going to fill out that many. One of the resources that I found very useful is this last book by Melissa Bowles-Terry and Cassandra Kveneld. So Classroom Assessment Techniques for Librarians. It has some really great information about both things like this and less formal formative assessment that you could do, kind of just asking questions as you're working with students. So if you're looking for other ideas, I highly recommend that book. But what we would do is we'd have, I came up with a list of questions. There were a few that were free response, and then some that were Likert scale questions. So you rank the statement on a scale of 1 to 5. And for those scale questions, what we'd do is we'd select only the ones that mapped to the outcomes we had picked for that class, rather than give students all of them and say, end up asking students who had just been to the library for the first time and were focused on analyzing one source in front of them, questions about archives restrictions and privacy and things that were really out of the realm of that particular class. So this is part of the chart kind of mapping learning outcomes based on the focus of the class that we determine kind of as we're speaking with the professor, or I think as someone else said, supply if the professor does not have one. So for all of our classes, this one from the Carini article is just to know that the library exists. And then for some of the others, one of our main class focuses is helping students figure out how to analyze primary sources. That might be one individual source, or maybe putting some in conversation with a few others. But that's the mapping of the kind of goals that we use most often. I would say these two learning outcomes, I think, are the things that we focus on most frequently. For some of the more advanced classes, we have other questions that we add in. So if it's a class that's going to be they're preparing to do further archival research, we'll also ask them some questions to try and gauge their understanding of, how do you find and access archival material? Things like, do you know what a finding aid is and how to use it? And try to get at, might they understand concepts like original order or what a record group is and what that means. And then this last category is we probably only get 1 or 2 classes a year where this is really, really a focus of our instruction sessions with them. So maybe a class that's preparing to do a group research project where they spend a large part of the semester working with our collections. And so that's kind of less frequently, but we would get into questions of, if I want to use this material and it's going to be, say, on a website that the class is creating, here are some further things that you might end up needing to think about. Here's how you would figure out if there are copyright or permissions issues involved. But these both, I think, are questions that we ask less frequently because they're less frequently a focus of the classes that we work with. Primary source analysis is the main thing that professors generally want us to work on, especially if we have limited time. And so here you can see on the left is those, the kind of the focus of the class. And then based on the outcomes that were listed in the previous slide, these are the questions that we'd ask. So we ask everybody, what kind of sources, do you understand what kind of sources you can find at the Bentley? Trying to get at, do they realize that we collect Michigan history and the history of the university? Because we want to make sure they don't come here looking for a material that's actually another 20-minute bus ride away at one of the other campus libraries. But then also some of these further questions where they would rank on a scale of 1 to 5, how well they understand, the context of a source's creation, why the Bentley only has certain things, how collections are organized in a very broad sense, how they might find sources, and then for creating original work, things like how to cite sources and why we might have privacy restrictions on some things. And then our free response questions, which have turned out to be, I think, the most useful thing, are pretty basic assessment questions you would ask if you don't have much time. So what's the most important thing you learned? What's still unclear or confusing? And then we added this last one, the please list online tools you would use, because asking students to rate their own understanding sometimes doesn't get at their actual understanding. So we're trying to ask questions that both ask them to say, how well do you think you understand these things and what's still confusing to you? But then also, can you demonstrate your understanding? So if they, we were talking about how to find something in the finding aids and how to use a finding aid in class. And then their response to that, oh, I would go to JSTOR. We would know that we were off on the wrong track somewhere. And this did, so that, we would take those questions and delete out the ones that were not applicable to the learning outcome for a particular class. Like previous presenters, kill a lot of trees, print to everybody at the end of class. We didn't do every class. I think our goal was normally to get at least half of the classes, and then also to make sure that, particularly for those less frequently used learning outcomes, that we did get some of those. So if there was a class that we knew would be doing, we're preparing students to come back to do later research, or they were going to be creating a project based on their research, we'd try a little bit harder to get to that one because we still have less data on those. But again, the brevity of some of our class visits, the 50 minutes that gets cut down to 35 or 40 is part of the reason that sometimes we would look at a class kind of at the end and go, well, I don't want to take time away from the questions that students are still asking to hand out the survey. So sometimes I show up with my little stack of tree killing paper and then elect not to use it because students, the conversation that we were having was a little bit more important, and then save it for the next class visit. But because all of our instruction for fall 2020 and spring 2021 was online, I wanted to find a different way to do this and to do the same thing where we adjusted for which learning outcomes each class was focused on, rather than send students a survey with all of the questions, including ones that weren't really applicable to their situation. So over last summer, I reworked the survey to fit into Qualtrics. And we distributed it at the very end of the semester rather than after each class, which pushed our response rate down a little bit. But I added a question at the beginning that was just which class did you virtually visit the Bentley with? And then depending on their answers, I used Qualtrics's survey flow feature to set which sets of questions they would be answering, basically. I'm not sure that's the easiest way that I would recommend doing this because it took a lot of typing different classes in, but it did work. Students got sent to the relevant questions. In terms of outcomes from the surveys, which we've been doing since about 2018, we generally get about 4.5 out of 5 for those questions that have to do with analyzing primary sources, maybe a little bit lower, so 4.2 for the doing archival research or creating new material segments, which I think based on the fact that students may have a little bit more experience analyzing primary sources already, and it's that what we have the most experience teaching makes sense. But certainly some of those questions about, how do I navigate a finding aid? When would I look for something in the catalog versus the finding aids? Those finding sources, doing research questions are things that we do want to work on in future. Students found that primary source analysis, that practice useful, but they also, in the free response questions, they listed, one of the things they listed most often was just the fact that the Bentley existed and that it was there for them to use, and information about how they would use the collections and the subject matter of the collections, which might be less applicable if your library is one that has a wider variety of material, but because we're pretty focused on the university and the state, that's an important thing for us to know. And then also revelations that they had about the subject matter of their class, maybe as it related to or was inspired by the sources that they were looking at, which is not necessarily something that is listed in, guidelines that are focused on archival literacy, but is nonetheless pretty important, particularly to the professors who are deciding, how and when do I want to bring my students, take an entire class period for an archives visit. So I'd like to dig into that a little bit more as well. Students often listed or recognized the value of specific resources, but didn't have the vocabulary quite right. So we got a lot of answers about, I would use the finding guides to find material that's related to my research interest. So thinking in terms of they're on the right track, they've got the right concept, we might just have to review the vocabulary if they come in to do individual research, if their class returns, that sort of thing. When we switched to digital instruction and a digital survey, I noticed that students had more questions about the context of material viewed online, rather than if it was something that they had pulled out of a box. And then also that they appreciated being able to follow along with things like searching demonstrations in ways that, because of our physical classroom setup, we hadn't always been able to provide before. We have a computer and a projector, but students don't generally have their own laptops to kind of practice things, because we have a general lack of outlets in that room. It's probably not an unfamiliar dilemma for people. But other than that, I was surprised to see how kind of consistent the responses were with earlier semesters. I think, by the time they responded to this, students had been attending online classes all semester. I'm sure it was not their favorite thing in the world, but it didn't seem odd to them to do this particular thing virtually because they'd already done so much else on Zoom. In future, I think realizing that so many students think it's important that we just or what's important to them is that the Bentley exists and kind of knowing how to get there and what they can use it for. I foresee us focusing on providing information about our new and still evolving appointment scheduling system, changes to the campus bus system, and many other things due to the pandemic and various reopening procedures, just to make sure that that hasn't become a way more confusing process for them than it has been in previous semesters. Like to build in more opportunities for students to ask about the nature of archival collections, original order, and collecting practices. Those are things that students also mention having, like, not understanding at the end of class or having more questions about. I don't necessarily see that as a failure of our instruction. In some ways, I think it's kind of the logical next step. You know, once they've thought about, this is how I would put this source in context with others, then they start thinking about, well, how did it get here? So that actually to me is an encouraging sign that they're asking about that, but I would like to address it a little bit more and more explicitly, and build in opportunities for us to discuss that earlier. Maybe provide more written instructions for in-person class activities. And then we've also created some video tutorials for those searching exercises so that students can follow along, even in their own time before or after class. Rather than having to remember everything that we demonstrate up on a projector screen. And then finally, some of that confusion around the context of digital sources, I took to heart as I was moving scans into a Canvas site for a summer research project group that we worked with, being very, very careful to mimic the structure of the original collection, the file structure, as we moved kind of excerpts of different files into Canvas for them, and making sure that there was easy access to the finding aids right there next to the files, so that there weren't opportunities to open up 5 other windows and get confused. And that's, I think, the kind of the sum of what we're thinking we'll do with this data now. I'm happy to answer questions, obviously, along with the other presenters or after this event.
Thank you so much, Sarah. And thank you so much to all of our presenters. These were amazing. So right now I'm going to stop the recording and open up the floor for questions.